Against the backdrop of jet aircraft, combat helicopters, and armored vehicles, the use of animals for military purposes seems like an anachronism. Yet under Vietnam's conditions, this method proved highly effective. Elephants, employed for thousands of years in agriculture and logging, unexpectedly became part of armed conflict once again. The jungles of Vietnam posed a serious obstacle to modern machinery. Trails were washed out by rains, and roads were impassable for heavy vehicles. In these conditions, elephants became indispensable freight carriers. They could overcome marshy terrain, move along narrow paths, and transport hundreds of kilograms of weapons, provisions, and ammunition. Thus emerged a unique phenomenon of the Vietnam War, the use of war elephants in guerrilla operations. These animals became a kind of living trucks along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the main supply artery for Viet Cong forces. American intelligence repeatedly recorded the movement of such caravans. When a target was detected, aviation was deployed. A-1 Huey helicopters and strike aircraft were used to destroy columns that included not only people and equipment, but also animals. One of the most striking episodes occurred in 1968, when U.S. helicopter crews attacked a caravan of elephants carrying weapons through the jungle. For the participants, it appeared unusual and even absurd. In the midst of a modern war, they had to open fire not on tanks and armored personnel carriers, but on animals whose use in combat seemed a relic of the distant past. This episode became a symbol of the paradoxical nature of the Vietnam War. On one side stood the advanced U.S. war machine with modern means of combat on the other, guerrillas employing methods rooted in antiquity. War elephants in Vietnam served as a reminder that jungle warfare did not obey customary laws. Helicopters with guided missiles existed side by side with animal caravans bearing weapons for guerrilla units. In our account, we will closely examine how and why, in the latter half of the 20th century, the need arose once again to use war elephants, what role they played in supply and combat operations, and how U.S. forces responded to this phenomenon. Mid-20th century Vietnam represented a complex and, in many ways, unique theater of war. It was a country where mountain ranges, impenetrable jungles, swampy lowlands, and unending rivers intersected. Natural conditions directly influenced the character of the war and the choice of means and methods of warfare. After the end of World War II, the French colony of Indochina became a focal point of global confrontation. In 1946, the First Indochina War began between France and the nationalist movement Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. Under these conditions, guerrilla methods became the foundation of Vietnamese tactics. Difficult trails, camouflage, and intimate knowledge of the terrain were widely used even then. The French experience showed that traditional military equipment had extremely limited applicability in the jungle. Heavy vehicles could not move along sodden roads. Tracked armor lost maneuverability, and any prolonged movement depended on bridges or ferries. It was at this point, after a long hiatus, that animals were once again employed. Horses, mules, and, in certain regions, elephants were used to transport equipment and provisions. When France left Vietnam in 1954 and the country was effectively divided into North and South, the conflict did not end. It merely entered a new phase, the Cold War. The Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam, while the United States backed South Vietnam. From that moment, the supply problem became critical. The North had to continuously deliver weapons, ammunition, and provisions to the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong. It was then that the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail was created, a ramified network of roads and paths running through Laos and Cambodia, linking North and South. This network became the true lifeline of the guerrilla movement. However, its maintenance was extremely difficult. Rains turned trails into rivers of mud, storms swept away bridges, and swamps swallowed entire carts. American aircraft regularly bombed transport nodes, attempting to cut off supplies. Under such conditions, traditional methods of transport proved more reliable than modern machinery. Vehicle columns were easily detected from the air and became targets for strikes. Animals, by contrast, could move covertly, leaving no telltale wheel or track marks on the ground. Elephants occupied a special place in this process. In the mountainous regions of Laos and Cambodia, these animals had been used for centuries by local populations to transport heavy loads and extract timber. They were well adapted to the climate and conditions of the region. They could cover dozens of kilometers over rough terrain, carry loads weighing up to half a ton, and, if necessary, swim across rivers. For Vietnamese guerrillas, the elephant became a natural ally. Its use required neither complex preparation nor fuel. It could feed on the vegetation abundant in the jungle and remained virtually irreplaceable where no truck could pass. The presence of elephants in Viet Cong caravans became an important factor in the resilience of the supply system. They carried weapons, mortars, ammunition, medical equipment, and provisions for units. In some cases, even light artillery systems were transported on their backs, later dismounted and prepared for action by hand. For the American side, this came as a surprise. Military reports from the mid-1960s onward recorded cases of animal transport being detected along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The U.S. Air Force Command was forced to account not only for the movement of vehicles and bicycles, but also for columns on elephants. Thus arose a paradoxical situation: an army possessing some of the most modern weapons in the world faced an adversary using methods known since antiquity. This contrast became one of the defining features of the Vietnam War. Accordingly, the historical context of using war elephants in Vietnam is directly linked to the specifics of the terrain, climatic conditions, and guerrilla tactics. Under circumstances in which high-tech weaponry did not always produce the expected results, traditional, even archaic, methods proved effective. The use of elephants in the Vietnam War was primarily practical. These animals became a kind of living transport that undertook tasks beyond the reach of modern machinery. Each elephant could carry some 400 to 500 kilograms of cargo. In jungle conditions, this was comparable to the capacity of a light truck. At the same time, an elephant required no fuel, spare parts, or repairs. It was enough to provide food and water, no great challenge in the tropics. The animals fed on leaves, branches, and grasses always close at hand. Elephant caravans were used primarily to transport weapons, automatic rifles, bolt-action rifles, grenades, mortars, and ammunition. In addition, the animals carried food, medical supplies, clothing, and equipment for Viet Cong units. In some instances, reports noted the transport of disassembled artillery systems, later installed at positions by hand. Elephants had a crucial advantage: they could move where machinery could not. During the rainy season, trails turned into streams of water and mud. Light vehicles bogged down, and heavy armored machines became useless. The elephant continued forward, slowly and steadily overcoming obstacles. It could cross marshes, climb slopes, and even ford rivers by swimming. For the guerrillas, using elephants also conferred a tactical advantage. Animal movement in the jungle was less visible from the air than vehicle columns. Elephants left fewer characteristic traces that reconnaissance aircraft could spot. Moreover, the sounds of their movement blended into the ambient noise of the jungle and did not reveal the caravan's presence at long distances. Organizationally, caravans were carefully structured groups. They were usually accompanied by mahouts familiar with the terrain and skilled in handling the animals. Elephants moved in single file along narrow paths, supporting one another. In some cases the animals were also used to build temporary camps or crossings, moving logs, reinforcing bridges, and clearing routes. The Viet Cong regarded elephants as a strategic resource. The loss of a single animal meant the loss of an entire load and significant logistical complications. Accordingly, elephants were carefully guarded. They were camouflaged in the jungle, halted during daytime overflights, and most often used at night, when American reconnaissance was more limited. Evidence suggests that in certain areas of Laos and Cambodia, several hundred elephants were engaged on behalf of the Viet Cong. The exact number is impossible to establish, but their role in sustaining supply resilience was unquestionable. The animals ensured a steady flow of cargo that enabled continued operations even under intense bombardment. American reports repeatedly recorded the movement of such caravans. At times, elephants became targets for airstrikes, an unusual sight for the latter half of the 20th century. From a military standpoint, however, it was justified. Destroying a caravan meant disrupting deliveries, delaying operations, and weakening Viet Cong positions in a given region. Thus, in the Vietnam War, elephants served as the trucks of the jungle, reliable, resilient, and practically indispensable where machinery proved powerless. Their use became a distinctive feature of guerrilla logistics and a symbol of how ancient methods could effectively coexist with modern means of warfare. One of the key elements of the Vietnam War was the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex system of roads, paths, and lines of communication linking North Vietnam with the southern provinces. It was not a single road, but an entire network of routes totaling more than 16,000 kilometers and passing through Laos and Cambodia. From a military perspective, the trail represented the main supply artery. Along it came everything necessary for the Viet Cong: weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, provisions, and personnel. Without this network of communications, the guerrilla movement in the south would have been isolated and deprived of the ability to wage full-scale combat. Construction and development of the trail began in the late 1950s, shortly after Vietnam's partition. Initially, it consisted of narrow paths used by peasants and hunters. Over time, through the efforts of North Vietnam's engineering units, these paths were widened and turned into roads suitable for columns, bicycles, and, in some places, light vehicles. The trail's chief characteristic was its flexibility. It was not static, rather, it was a system of routes that constantly changed and adapted to the conditions of war. When one section was bombed, a bypass route was immediately laid out. Vietnamese engineers and local residents restored bridges, built new ferries, and camouflaged roads in the shortest possible time. The American side fully understood the trail's importance. From the early 1960s, it became the prime target of air campaigns. Thousands of tons of bombs were dropped on areas where routes were believed to pass. Napalm, cluster munitions, and defoliants that destroyed vegetation were used. The objective was clear: deprive the Viet Cong of vital supplies. Despite the scale of these efforts, the United States never succeeded in completely blocking movement along the trail. The main reason was the system's unique organization. Movement occurred in small groups, primarily at night. A variety of means were used: bicycles with reinforced frames capable of carrying up to 200 kilograms of cargo, boats, rafts, and animals. Here, elephants played a special role. In the mountainous regions of Laos and Cambodia, they became an important link in the logistic chain. The animals could move along narrow paths where vehicles could not pass and overcome marshy areas. Elephant caravans often carried the heaviest loads: mortars, ammunition, and medical equipment. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was more than a road. Along it were rest bases, depots, hospitals, and workshops. It was a full-fledged infrastructure concealed in the jungle. It enabled long marches and sustained supply to units in the south. Camouflage was decisive: depots were hidden in caves, roads were covered by the tree canopy, and bridges were temporary and collapsible. According to American analysts, thousands of people and hundreds of tons of cargo moved along the trail daily. Despite continuous airstrikes, the system remained viable. Moreover, by the end of the war it had expanded and become even more resilient. The trail became a symbol of combining the simplest and most effective methods. Next to bicycles and improvised carts moved caravans of elephants. Ancient methods existed side by side with modern ones, forming a unique logistic network that proved stronger than America's technological superiority. Thus, the Ho Chi Minh Trail became not just a supply route but also a symbol of northern resilience and ingenuity. In its existence, tradition, local knowledge, and modern military requirements converged. The participation of elephants in this system vividly illustrated how ancient practices found their place in a conflict of the late 20th century. For the U.S. Armed Forces, the enemy's use of elephants as transport presented an unexpected challenge. In a war where American strategy relied on technological superiority, the appearance of animal caravans seemed not only unusual but highly inconvenient for established reconnaissance and targeting systems. From the outset of the campaign, U.S. intelligence paid special attention to Viet Cong supply routes. Reconnaissance aircraft, early unmanned aerial vehicles, and ground observers tracked column movements. Maps marked roads used by trucks, bicycles, or foot units. But elephant caravans did not fit neatly into this scheme. The animals moved slowly, in small groups, often along paths concealed beneath dense canopies. They could not be tracked using standard methods such as radio interception or monitoring vehicle traffic. For U.S. forces, elephant caravans were difficult targets. Detection usually occurred by chance, when reconnaissance spotted them from above or ground units stumbled upon them. Nevertheless, from the standpoint of U.S. strategy, such targets were to be destroyed on par with equipment. Official reports included data indicating that animal-type transport means were struck during air operations. For the military, This had a concrete implication: destroying an elephant caravan was equivalent to liquidating a vehicle column. A particularly vivid example was the 1968 event. During operations, American helicopter crews noted the movement of a large caravan transporting weapons through the jungle. After reconnaissance confirmation, a rocket strike was delivered. The targets were not only the personnel accompanying the cargo but the animals themselves. According to participants, the episode made a strong impression. For soldiers accustomed to firing on armored vehicles or fortifications, destroying an elephant caravan felt like confronting an anachronism. Reactions among U.S. servicemen were mixed. On one hand was the cold calculus of war: each destroyed caravan meant disrupted deliveries of weapons and provisions, directly affecting Viet Cong effectiveness. On the other hand, many soldiers found such operations psychologically taxing. Some veterans described a sense of absurdity: we're fighting in the 20th century with helicopters and rockets, and we're shooting at elephants, as if we'd gone back to the ancient armies. Such cases were barely covered in the American press, as they could provoke public backlash already critical of the war. Yet closed military reports regularly mentioned the destruction of transport caravans employing animals. The practical aspect was also significant. For the Viet Cong, an elephant was not merely transport but a resource whose acquisition and training took years. The loss of a single animal delivered a serious blow to the supply system. U.S. aviation understood this well and regarded strikes on such caravans as an effective means of pressure. At the same time, the elephant's vulnerability to air power became obvious. They could not quickly hide; their size made them visible even under canopies; their speed gave little chance of escape. As a result, caravans increasingly became targets for helicopters and aircraft, and the use of animals gradually declined. Historically, this aspect highlights the contrast between the two sides of the conflict. The Americans, equipped with A-1 helicopters, jet aircraft, and modern artillery, faced an opponent using methods rooted in millennia-old tradition. The clash of approaches inevitably produced situations where high technology met primitive yet effective solutions. Thus, the confrontation of American air power versus elephants became one of the Vietnam War's unique episodes, symbolizing not only military struggle but a collision of eras: modernity and antiquity, the industrial world and traditional culture. The year 1968 was among the most intense of the Vietnam War. At that time, the U.S. Army was actively trying to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail and cut Viet Cong supplies. Within the framework of air operations, U.S. helicopter units regularly patrolled areas with recorded enemy activity. It was then that one of the best-known attacks on an elephant caravan took place. According to military reports, reconnaissance detected a large column moving through Laos. Initially, it was assumed to be vehicles concealed by jungle cover. Upon approach, however, one Huey crews and strike pilots observed distinctive silhouettes. They were elephants transporting cargo. The animals moved in single file along a narrow path, accompanied by Vietnamese guerrillas. Command decided to strike. From a military logic standpoint, it was justified: the caravan carried weapons and ammunition intended for operations in the south. Helicopters delivered a rocket and gun strike on the column. According to pilots' recollections, the scene made a heavy impression. Instead of the usual machines and fortifications, the targets were living creatures attempting to take cover in the jungle yet too slow to escape. Some American veterans later remarked that this event became, for them, a symbol of the war's absurdity. They remembered a picture of modern rockets launched from helicopters striking a caravan of animals as if from an ancient army. In their memoirs, they described a strange sensation, as if they were participants in a collision of two eras at once. Practically speaking, the operation was deemed successful. The caravan was destroyed; a significant amount of weapons and ammunition failed to reach its destination. Official reports referred to the destruction of transport targets, while the animals were rarely mentioned directly, an attempt to soften descriptions and avoid unnecessary questions. However, in classified documents, the military directly recorded the use and destruction of elephants. Today these records are important historical sources, revealing how diverse and unusual the methods of warfare in Vietnam could be. For the Viet Cong, the loss of such a caravan was a serious blow. Each elephant was a valuable resource requiring years of rearing and training. Moreover, the animals often belonged to local residents who aided the guerrillas. Their deaths meant not only the loss of transport but also a blow to local trust. The 1968 episode demonstrated how vulnerable animals were to modern air power. After this case, the use of elephants on the most dangerous stretches of the Ho Chi Minh Trail gradually declined. The Viet Cong increasingly relied on more discreet means, bicycles, boats, and small porter groups. Even so, they could not entirely abandon elephants, particularly in mountainous regions where the animals remained the only reliable means of transporting heavy loads. Today, historians regard this episode as one of the most unusual pages of the Vietnam War. It underscores the conflict's paradox, in which ancient methods coexisted with modern technologies. Helicopters and rockets pitted against an elephant caravan became a symbol of the meeting of not only armies but entire eras in the Vietnamese jungle. The Vietnam War tested not only technology and tactics but also the mental resilience of soldiers. The participation of elephants in hostilities turned out to be a factor with unexpected psychological effects on both American servicemen and Vietnamese guerrillas. For the U.S. military, armed with modern means, the enemy's use of animals seemed absurd. Helicopter pilots involved in attacks on caravans often recalled the strange feeling of opening fire on targets that, in peacetime, were associated with exoticism and even grandeur. They remembered rockets and machine gun bursts striking not armor or fortifications, but animals laden with crates of weapons. This produced conflicting emotions. On the one hand stood military calculation: destroying a caravan meant disrupting supplies, potentially saving American lives on the ground. On the other hand, for many participants such episodes left a sense of awkwardness or even guilt. Some veterans wrote that these operations caused greater psychological strain than attacks on conventional vehicle columns. The cultural aspect must also be considered. In mid-20th century American society, the elephant was associated more with wisdom, the circus, or the zoo than with war. Confronting images beyond familiar frames heightened the sense of absurdity. For soldiers, it became a marker of how different the Vietnam War was from standard notions of combat. For Vietnamese guerrillas, the picture looked different. For them, elephants were part of everyday life, a traditional helper in farming and logging. Using animals to transport weapons was not perceived as unusual or morally dubious. On the contrary, it underscored continuity with tradition and the ability to exploit available resources amid constraints. Yet the death of animals under air strikes was deeply painful. For local residents, an elephant was not merely transport but a cultural and domestic value. The loss of such an animal meant not only material deprivation but a profound emotional blow, intensifying hatred for the enemy and strengthening the resolve to resist. The American side, analyzing such cases, also noted their psychological significance for the population. Destroying an elephant caravan could cause short-term supply difficulties, but at the same time became a propaganda factor that the Viet Cong used to mobilize support. Stories of animals being bombed spread among locals as evidence of the enemy's cruelty and inhumanity. Thus, the psychological effect of such episodes proved two-sided. For Americans, they became a source of inner tension and a sense of absurdity. For the Vietnamese, they intensified the determination to fight and framed the war as the defense not only of the country but of a way of life in which the elephant had a significant place. From a historical perspective, this aspect underscores how far the Vietnam War lay outside conventional understandings of conflict. Not only armies and ideologies clashed, but worldviews. A modern soldier with rockets and communication systems felt engaged in a struggle against a past that came alive in the image of an elephant caravan. A local farmer perceived the death of animals as a personal insult, turning the war into an even more intimate affair. As a result, the use of elephants became not only a logistical but a psychological phenomenon. It showed that war is not only a clash of technologies but a struggle over symbols, images, and emotions that shape how both sides perceive events. Despite its effectiveness in jungle conditions, the use of elephants in the Vietnam War entailed a number of problems and inevitably led to serious losses. The principal vulnerability was the animals' dependence on natural conditions and their physical limitations. Unlike vehicles, elephants could not move at high speed and remained conspicuous targets if detected. Their large size made camouflage extremely difficult, especially in open areas. Even under dense canopies, the animals stood out to aerial observation, particularly with modern photoreconnaissance. U.S. aviation quickly learned to recognize elephant caravans. Air Force reports from the late 1960s increasingly mentioned strikes against animal-type transport targets. This meant that, when detected, caravans became priority targets for helicopters and aircraft. Losses in such cases were heavy. Not only cargoes and escorts were destroyed, but the animals themselves, who had little chance to escape. Another problem was the high cost of losing each elephant for the Viet Cong. The animal was not a mass resource. Its acquisition, rearing, and training took years. Unlike a bicycle or boat, manufactured or repaired relatively quickly, the loss of an elephant meant the loss of substantial investment. Moreover, in some areas of Laos and Cambodia, elephants belonged to local peasants who provided them to the guerrillas. The death of an animal was a catastrophe for a family, inflicting not only economic but moral damage. Operational difficulties also existed. Despite their adaptation to the climate, elephants required specific care. In wartime, this was not easy to provide. Long jungle marches exhausted the animals. Diseases and injuries reduced their effectiveness. The Viet Cong were forced to allocate special teams for their care, requiring additional resources and personnel. Logistical risks were significant as well. Elephant caravans moved slowly, creating opportunities for ambush and air attack. Under fire, the animals often panicked, causing chaos in the column and further losses. There were cases where a dead or wounded elephant blocked a path, delaying the movement of the entire group. The U.S. side regarded the destruction of such caravans as an effective way to damage the supply system. Military documents emphasized that the loss of a single caravan could delay arms deliveries for weeks. Thus, each successful strike on an elephant column had strategic importance. At the same time, for the Viet Cong, these losses did not lead to a complete rejection of animals. In mountainous and hard-to-reach areas, there was simply no alternative. Bicycles and porters were effective for light loads, but only elephants could deliver heavy weapons and ammunition. Therefore, despite the risks, caravans continued to operate, though routes increasingly shifted to more remote and dangerous areas. In sum, using elephants involved serious problems. The loss of animals and cargoes dealt tangible blows to guerrilla logistics, while the psychological and economic damage increased pressure on the local population. Nevertheless, under Vietnam War conditions, these difficulties did not negate the expediency of their use. Elephants remained an important element of supply despite all the threats they faced. By the late 1960s, the use of elephants in the Vietnam War gradually declined. Despite their value as transport in hard-to-navigate jungle conditions, the course of combat operations, the active use of air power, and new supply methods made caravans increasingly vulnerable. The decisive factor was U.S. air superiority. Systematic bombardment of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and its branches, as well as constant helicopter patrols, greatly complicated the use of large, slow-moving transport. Despite camouflage and night movements, elephants remained overly conspicuous targets. Their deaths under air strikes were not only frequent but dealt serious blows to Viet Cong logistics. Losses became ever more pronounced. Each elephant was the product of a long process of rearing and training and could not be quickly replaced. Unlike bicycles or porters that could be deployed en masse, large animals required special conditions and experienced handling. Each loss made the supply system less resilient. There were internal reasons for reducing their use as well. The guerrilla army increasingly relied on decentralized, mobile delivery methods. Bicycles adapted to carry hundreds of kilograms and numerous porter groups proved more flexible and less vulnerable. They could quickly change routes, move covertly, and did not present such obvious targets from the air. Moreover, the use of elephants became a propaganda tool for the enemy. U.S. military briefings highlighted the archaic methods of the Viet Cong to showcase American technological superiority. The very fact of employing animals in a late 20th century war was presented as a symbol of the opponent's backwardness. Even so, the guerrillas could not completely abandon elephants until the very end of the conflict. In mountainous areas of Laos and Cambodia, where terrain was especially difficult for machinery, they remained the only means of delivering heavy cargoes. Their use, however, was limited and tightly controlled. Caravans moved mainly at night. Routes were constantly changed. The animals were thoroughly camouflaged. By the early 1970s, the role of elephants in supply had markedly diminished. They were replaced by more mobile and numerous means. The war entered a new phase, prioritizing concealment, speed, and dispersion. The twilight of war. Elephants in Vietnam symbolized the shift from traditional methods to more modern forms of guerrilla logistics. It showed that even in jungles, where ancient methods seemed appropriate and effective, the technological factor and the evolving character of combat gradually displaced the archaic. Historians note that the Vietnam War was the last major conflict in which elephants were used for military purposes. Afterward, they disappeared from the practice of warfare, surviving only in the memories of participants and historical sources as evidence of an unusual interweaving of eras. Thus, the demise of war elephants became the logical end of an entire epoch. A war that had begun with animal and bicycle caravans ended with mass use of aviation, rockets, and high-tech systems. Having served humanity in war for millennia, elephants in Vietnam took their final step in the history of armed conflict. The story of war elephants in the Vietnam War is a reminder of how contradictory armed conflict can be. In a setting where helicopters, jet aircraft, and modern weapons clashed, the battlefield once again saw animals whose role in warfare seemed long consigned to the past. Elephants became a symbol of the Viet Cong's persistence and ingenuity in using every available means to survive and continue the struggle. For Americans, they embodied the war's absurdity, a confrontation where high technology met ancient methods. By the end of the 1960s, the era of war elephants had come to a close. Yet their very participation in the Vietnam War stands as a vivid example of how tradition and modern technology could coexist even in a large-scale conflict of the latter half of the 20th century.